Hello? Hello?
Hi, Jen. We'll start in just a moment.
Okay.
Pam, I think you're up.
Okay, my video's not on. As our country reacts to the tragic occurrences of social injustice and polarization, the time for charting a course to build a culture of belonging is now. Everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and valued, but how we get to that ideal requires a significant commitment and conscious effort. There is no more critical time than now to put our greatest effort forward to become a community where everyone, no matter race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, income, age, physical ability, or religion, feels they belong. Good afternoon. I'm Pam Clark-Reidenbach, the Executive Director of NICNE, the Northern Illinois Center for Nonprofit Excellence at NIU, and your host for today's virtual conversation on othering and belonging. NICNE has been meeting with over 30 individuals from the community to discuss how we build a bridge to belonging in Rockford. We are pleased that you have chosen to tune in for this vital community conversation, where a group of Rockford residents is joined by John A. Powell, an internationally recognized expert and thought leader on civil rights, civil liberties, and structural racism, among many other talents. Professor Powell will share his insights and clarity on othering and belonging and respond to questions from community members on how we can build a culture of belonging in our community. We hope you will use this conversation as inspiration to advance efforts in your places of business and worship, your neighborhoods, dinner tables, and associations. At the end of this conversation, you will see options for getting involved. We hope you will join current efforts or create your own to build bridges between people and institutions, because we are stronger together when we recognize our shared humanity. And it is by the actions we take. We give thanks to Professor Powell for being with us today. These conversations would not be possible without our generous lead sponsor, the Shellstrom Family Foundation. We also thank our supporting sponsor, Transform Rockford, community resource sponsor, the Rockford Public Library, and media sponsor, WREX. This is an afternoon of hope, what can be a start to co-creation of a culture of belonging in Rockford. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you David Sidney from Transform Rockford. So David, if we could build a culture of belonging where we don't need to name it, we just are, wouldn't that be transformational?
Yes, Pam, it would be transformational. And I'm excited about today's conversation. Thank you and the entire NICNE organization for providing leadership and on this very important work to build this culture here in our region. And I also want to thank you and everyone here. You've been convening conversations over the last several months leading up to this point. And so thank you again for your efforts. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Sidney. I'm the Executive Director at Transform Rockford. And on behalf of the entire Transform Rockford Steering Committee, we are glad to be a sponsor for today's community conversation. I remember when one of our staff team members approached me on the topic of othering and belonging, and after he attended the Collective Impact Forum last year with Pam and heard Professor Powell, and he came back energized, charged, and said, you have to read his material, you have to listen to his talks. And so I did, and it has changed me in many ways, and I'm looking forward to what's to come today. Transform Rockford, sees today's conversation not only being an important topic, but foundational for our community's transformation, as Pam, as you alluded to. We see this aligned with the stated community shared values, becoming a top 25 community, and the strategies that the community set out several years ago. We will have actually more to share in the coming weeks on how Transform Rockford will facilitate work with stakeholders and partners throughout the Rockford region in building a culture of belonging in 2021 and beyond. I want to encourage all of us today, as you're joining us in this conversation, to just to do three things. These are things that I'm trying to get better at daily. First is leave our worlds. Let go of the familiar, take risk, and step out regarding othering, this topic of othering and building this culture of belonging. The second thing is enter into someone else's world. Let's practice active, humble, and curious listening, not only today, but going forward. And I believe that all of us who have joined, we're doing just that. And then the third thing I want to just share is allow ourselves to be formed by others, to open up to what Professor Powell has to say, his worldview on this area, and at the same time continue to hold to your values and beliefs as well. I'm looking forward to listening to Professor Powell and engaging in dialogue with our fellow community members. And so now I want to introduce one of my teammates at Transform Rockford, Gabrielle Turina, who will introduce our speaker today and moderate today's conversation. Gabrielle.
Thank you so much, David. Good afternoon, Rockford. My name is Gabrielle Turina, and I am the Community Engagement and Communications Manager for Transform Rockford, and I will be the moderator for today's powerful community discussion on building belonging. Mr. Powell, are you there, sir?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Good morning.
It says the host has stopped me, so I have to.
Let's bring him on, host.
Very good.
Good morning, sir, from California.
Thank you.
Now, I understand you spoke with some students in the local area. How did that go for you today?
Well, it went fine for me. I have to ask the students how it went for them. No, it was a delight to be able to talk to them. It was it was relatively short, but it was still good to be able to talk to them. And education is something, obviously, I think is critical.
Definitely. Well, we're glad that you were able to speak with them. We are just thrilled to have you here today to share your incredible knowledge and expertise with us. I know that you will have some enlightening conversation that will be substantive and thought-provoking. I did want for our city to know some things about who you are and what you do. So I'm going to read a very small fraction of your biography. John A. Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights, civil liberties, structural racism, housing, poverty, and democracy. John is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, a research institute that brings together scholars, community advocates, communicators, and policymakers to identify and eliminate the barriers to inclusive, just, and sustainable society, and to create transformative change toward a more equitable world. John has lived and worked in Africa, where he was the consultant to the governments of Mozambique and South Africa, and has also worked in both India and Brazil. He is one of the co-founders of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council and serves on the board of several national and international organizations. John has taught at numerous law schools, including Harvard and Columbia University. He is the author of several books, including his most recent work, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. He is well known for his work on targeted universalism and othering and belonging. I think that's actually a great place for us to start our conversation. I know this is probably going to be a very lengthy answer, and I really want to open this up for you to go into your you kind of have a presentation or some things that you talk about this, but I really want to talk about the concept of othering and belonging. What is that exactly? How were you drawn to making it your life's work? And I'd also would like to talk to you, I would like for you to talk about the concept of bridging and the inclusive we. So I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you, Gabrielle. But before I start, I have to, first of all, thank all of you for this opportunity and for the work you're doing in these sort of difficult times. But on a lighter note, what does 815 stand for?
That is our area code, 815.
Okay. So, this it's interesting, and I'll get to the formal presentation, although I'm less, committed to that and more. I want to have a conversation with you in some respects. But as we sort of reflect on our lives, there's a whole psychology around stories, and some people say that you don't have a self until you have a story, and then as we go through life, we have multiple stories, and not surprisingly, we have multiple selves. So when I sort of look back on my life, and I think this is not unusual, I think, oh yeah, I was always working on othering and belonging, even when I was 6, but it's probably not true. I think I was playing marbles when I was 6. But we rewrite our story, but there's a theme, at least a thread through my life in terms of caring about people, even going beyond people, caring about life, and seeing how some people, for whatever reason, get the message that they don't fully belong. And so when I did work, I've done work in terms of civil rights, I've done work in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in some ways, I think the othering and belonging framework captures all of that, but takes it even further. Obviously, we're very exercised and concerned in the country now around race. Race is one pivotal way of saying to people, you don't belong. There's something about you. But it's not just race. There was not too long ago when literally we closeted away people with serious disabilities. I met a woman a few years ago who told me she's probably a little younger than me, but up there in age, and she said that she had a sister, and she was actually Russian. And she said, I was asking her about her family, and she said her sister had a serious disability. And one day she went to the hospital and she never returned. And the family stopped speaking of her. And she just think they can closet away, if not killed her. Sometimes the way people talk, or the way we hear them, we say they're not part of the we. So I'll go into my formal presentation, but if you think about our Constitution, we the people, um, we the people. And then if we come to 1856, we have Chief Justice Taney, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, saying Black people can never be part of that we. Which means from his perspective, and it wasn't just his perspective because he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he was writing a court opinion that would be the law of the land, saying Black people can't appear in court, they can't vote, they are in a sense non-people, they are other. And he said whether they were free or enslaved. And he went on to say Blacks had no rights. Except those rights that whites at their largesse was inclined to grant them. So this is othering at its extreme. Isabel Wilkerson just wrote a book called Caste, and she's talking about a caste system. So I've lived in India, and the caste system in India, and she would say the caste system in the United States, is one which ranked people. There's the top class, and those are the people who get to make the rules, who make the norms, who enjoy the benefits of their society. And then there's the bottom caste. And those people are not only given the worst work, they used to be called untouchables or delights in India. They could not formally marry out of their class. And no matter how smart they were, how nice they were less than. And that was not just inscribed in the society, it was inscribed in the religion. And this is the way of othering. So with that, I'll sort of go into my formal remarks if I can. I'm going to try to bring up a PowerPoint. And when I went to school, they didn't have PowerPoints. And they certainly didn't have Zoom. So I may be a little bit.
Probably become an expert at it this year.
Yeah, I know. All right, let's see. I'm seeing. I'm trying to find the right one here. Let me do one thing and then
No problem.
people bear with me for just 1 second.
Sure will.
Oh, that's the wrong one. That's the one from yesterday. Okay. All right, it's now up on my screen. I'll see if I can bring it. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, sir.
So again, it's really a pleasure to be here with you. I wish I was there with you in person instead of over Zoom, but I'm glad to be able to be here under these circumstances on Zoom. And I know I did a little background on your city, and I know that you've actually engaged in a number of efforts to move your city into a more inclusive city. And at some point, maybe in the question and answer, I'd like to find out more from what I read. You're not satisfied with what happened with those efforts, and I want to find out why they didn't go farther. as you sort of lean into this effort so that you can learn from that and maybe continue to build. Let's see now. So, Gabrielle, you asked me about othering and belonging. And I know it's a wonky term, but in a sense, othering captures something that's happening, not just in terms of race or in terms of gender or in terms of disability. It's something that's we do among humans across all kinds of axes. So it actually captures those, but it actually goes beyond that. And it's a problem not just in the United States, but it's a problem throughout the world right now. And to paraphrase W.B. Du Bois, I would say it's a problem of the 21st century. And so we'll go more into that. Here's sort of a technical definition of othering. So it's something that, even though there is a more technical definition, it's something that's also very close. We sort of understand when we say someone doesn't belong or they're not in the group or they're not part of the we. And again, the actual content of othering is empty. That is, we can put anything into it. We can put skin tone, class, race, religion, disability, age. The process is very similar, basically saying, again, people don't belong, or they're less than, or they're a threat. This is work by Professor Susan Fisk, and she looks at, this is called the stereotype content model of social cognition. And what she does is, there are two axes. One is how much you like someone. And the second axis is how competent you think someone is. And so if you think someone is competent and you like them, that's the gold standard. And if you think someone is, if you like them, but you don't think they're very competent, then certain things happen. We don't treat them as well. We don't think they, for example, should be in high offices. And then there are people who we think are competent, but we don't like. And this is a U.S. sample. She's done this now in 30 different countries. The nomenclature I wouldn't use, but this is some of her work. When you're disliked and you're considered less than competent, there's a part of the brain that when you see another human being, it lights up. And it's just recognition. It doesn't mean you're going to say hello. It doesn't mean you're going to go have coffee with the person. It just means nature has designed us so that we can recognize another human being. So when someone is not liked and seen as not competent, that part of the brain does not light up. So at an unconscious level, we actually don't recognize people as people. We're othering them at a deep level. And I've written an article about this, basically saying, when we don't see people as people, bad things happen to those people, or we do bad things to those people. And it might be from not giving them full benefits, to keeping them out of the country or out of our neighborhood, or literally killing them. So othering is quite powerful. So this is a short video that I'm going to show you as to why this is happening right now all over the world. Of all the forces shaping politics and power around the world, perhaps none are more important than our sense of who we are and who we are becoming. We are in a period of accelerated change in at least 4 areas: globalization, technology, the environment, and demographic change. We can only process so much change in a short period of time without experiencing anxiety, which is a normal biological reaction. But how we respond to this anxiety is social. Our response is greatly shaped by the stories presented by leadership and through culture. These stories speak to our deepest values and our core beliefs about who we are, many of which operate at the subconscious level. We can respond to these changes either as a threat or as an opportunity. The first response is breaking. The second is bridging. Breaking can create a deep fear of other groups, making it easier to accept false stories of us versus them. Breaking perpetuates isolation. hardens racism and builds oppressive systems, while driving our politics and institutions toward anti-democratic and inhumane practices. The other response is bridging, which calls on us to imagine a larger, more inclusive we. When we bridge, we see demographic change and our diverse identities as positive and enhancing who we are. Bridging calls on us to engage in healthy dialogue and requires us to listen deeply. Bridging does not mean abandoning your identity. Bridging means acknowledging our shared humanity, rejecting that there is a them, and moving toward a future where there is instead a new us. But when we bridge, we not only open up to others, we also open up to changes within ourselves, where we can participate in creating a society built on belonging. Okay, let me get back to So first of all, let me ask, can you hear me? Because I'm trying to get out of this screen.
So I think you may want to reshare your screen.
Okay.
And then just click to that next slide. Go.
Okay, that's not the, it's good enough, but it's not the.
And then you wanted to like pop out, right? Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that.
So at the very, very bottom, so it says notes and comments. There you go. Okay.
Okay, so here's what you just watched, and this is just a schematic of it. And basically it's saying that the change that we're experiencing is happening across these axes. You could add some others if you like the economy. But what it suggests is that we're going to have increased anxiety at the visceral level. This is not just something that affects humans, it affects almost all mammals. If change happens too fast, it stresses us. And we're actually in a period of heightened stress right now. Now, actually, it's interesting because when I initially did this, and the next time I do it, I'll make this addition, we weren't dealing with the pandemic. So literally the whole country and the whole world is sort of stressed. And but what you deal with this stress, with this anxiety, is largely shaped by narratives, leadership, structures, and organizations. So we don't have a natural reaction to the stress. We don't have a natural reaction to the anxiety. And on the far right, you can see there are 2 or 3 primary responses. One, of course, is I'll start with the one at the bottom, is bonding, which is basically where you connect deeply with your family or a close pod. And bonding is where you value people and you don't denigrate other people. So I love my family. I have a great family. That's not to detract from your family at all. I don't know your family. I'd like to, but I do know my family is pretty cool. So that's bonding. There's another response, which is breaking. The film talked about that. When you decide that the other is a threat, that it can be an economic threat, it can be a physical threat, it can be a spiritual threat. They're taking something away from me. It could be scarce resources, it could be symbolic, but somehow we perceive them as a threat. And out of that comes anger and fear. So that's the othering process, when we basically see the other, and it can be a soft kind of othering where we just don't see them at all, or a really violent othering where we see them as an existentialist threat. And then, of course, there's another way of looking at the apparent other, and that is empathy and belonging. And so we say we do that through building bridges. And bridging requires empathetic practice and empathetic listening to the other, the apparent other, about their suffering, their aspiration, and listening or bridging does not mean we agree with them. It does not mean they become us in a narrow sense, but they become part of this larger whole. They become part of the we. And these things happen at multiple levels. So I know the language is unusual, so I just want to take 1 second to say why belonging and bridging instead of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I think was a real move. So those of you who've been doing this work a long time, you will know that in the 80s, we talked about this work or some variation of it as tolerance. We had to tolerate each other. And people who were the object of that toleration weren't feeling it. It's like, I don't want to be tolerated. There's something wrong with that. There's nothing problematic about me that I need to be tolerated. And so we moved from there to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And equity also moves us away from a narrow concept of equality. But the way we practice, I'll just say inclusion, is that we're including someone in something that's already there. Dr. King wrote about at some point, he worried about integrating Blacks into a burning house. And what he's saying is that the thing that we're being included in is not our own making. I used the example of having a party, and it's my party, you're invited, but it's my party. So it's my music, my food, my friends, my arrangements, and you come as a guest. And it's maybe better than not being invited at all, but it's not your party. And at the end of the day, you have to leave. That's how we practice inclusion. And belonging takes us beyond that. Belonging says we co-create. It's our party. And so we all participate in picking the food, picking the music, picking the guest list. And we'll come back to that. So belonging takes us beyond inclusion. And equity, how it's come to be practiced in the United States, is largely in terms of closing disparities. And I'll say more about that when I talk about targeted universalism. But the goal is not just to close disparities, because if that's all we're doing, we're assuming that the favored group has whatever we should all have. Excuse me. So I talked this morning with the students about a situation in Detroit that I'm involved in, where we looked at the school system, and in Detroit, Black students were only 20% of them were only reading at grade level. 80% of the students weren't reading at grade level, and a high percentage of those students couldn't read at all. Well, for white students, there are not many in Detroit school system, but what few that are, 50% were reading at grade level. Excuse me. So equity would say we need to close that disparity, but we're not trying to get people to 50% reading level. We want everybody to be reading at grade level, including the white students. So that takes us beyond equity, and we'll talk about that more when I talk about targeted universalism. But the idea is that we want a universal goal that's not tied to necessarily what the favored group has, because often the favored group itself does not have what it should have. So we've been on this journey as a country and as a world in terms of equality. And of course, 200 years ago, equality was a radical concept, and people didn't understand it and still don't really understand it. Equality is, in Western culture, really comes from Aristotle. And Aristotle's concept of equality, I will assert, is closer to targeted universalism. Equity, again, looking largely at disparities. Inclusion, we talked about that. You're being asked to join someone else's things. And so we're actually trying to move toward belonging. And we think that Gabrielle asked about how long I was doing this work. And I would think, in some sense, when I was 6, I was doing this work, but so were you. You've been actually in a process of trying to create a belonging world. You just didn't have the language. So today, after today, hopefully you have the language. And it matters, the language matters. And there are different ways in which we don't know. Sometimes we don't know things because we can't know them directly. Like you can't know how many neurons are firing in your brain right now. It's beyond our capacity to know that. Also, sometimes we don't know because things don't fit our narrative. So we can't see things because they don't fit our narrative. I talked about the Detroit schools. When we presented this information to the legislature, the first response was, well, those kids, particularly Black kids, aren't learning because they can't learn. That was the narrative. Well, if that's the case, then there's nothing for the school to do. But that wasn't empirical tested. That was just a perspective that they had. And sometimes we don't know things because we refuse to know, and sometimes because of inattention. And so right now we're in a space where we're trying to understand more about each other, more about our history. And to some people that's hard. It's like, well, you're not being very nice. You're talking about slavery. That makes us sound like a bad country. It's bad, good, or indifferent. It's our history. We have to know our history. One of the impacts of being other is that you don't have an effective voice. You don't have representation. You lack recognition, and you lack power. You probably, throughout the talk, hear me say a lot about Detroit. I'm from Detroit. There was one period in Michigan where virtually more than half of the majority Black cities was under emergency management. What that means is that the elected representatives of the city were ignored, and the state had appointed emergency managers. When Detroit went through bankruptcy, and I was very much involved in that. And again, people felt very othered. It's not that the city or the elected officials always did the right thing, but they felt like our voice and our representation and our power had been basically stunted. So not belonging has consequences, and those consequences are serious. They're psychological, they're performance, they're physical, they're emotional. Everyone wants to belong. Everyone needs to belong. And when you are deeply othered, you actually experience trauma. And you can experience trauma at an individual level, but you can also experience it at a group level. And so when we think about what happened with Katrina, clearly the people trapped in Katrina was traumatized. And even those who weren't trapped directly, to have family members and friends and people you associate with trapped created trauma. So again, to be othered and be part of a group that's othered has serious consequences. In the issue of race, sometimes we think that, well, race is such a hard issue. Wouldn't it be better if we were colorblind? Of course, this comes from both a misunderstanding of, I think, Dr. King, and a misunderstanding of Justice Harlan in the 1900s. But we know from the mind science, you can't not see that the unconscious sees, and it actually acts, even if we don't consciously notice race. And we notice it not because race in and of itself is important. We notice it because in our society, we actually use it as a marker. We make it important. We perform race. And so when you're dealing with people who are otherized, if you will, because of their race, then race becomes salient. If I lived in Africa, race was not salient in Africa. People didn't talk in terms of race. They didn't even understand what the issue was. In fact, when I went to Africa, and white Americans would come over, and sometimes there'd be tension between white Americans and Black Americans. Oftentimes the Africans was like, "What's the deal? You're all Americans as far as we can see." But within a given society, We have prominent ways of marking people and of othering people, of saying who belongs. And once we do that, those things become important. And we can't just ignore them at an individual level when we have made them important at a social level. So the opposite of othering then is not saming, but belonging. So in liberal society, oftentimes we say, I don't see race, I don't see gender. And we think that's a good thing. First of all, it's doubtful that the unconscious is going along with that position. And there's a lot of data, empirical data to suggest that. But secondly, not to be seen, not to be noticed, that's not necessarily a positive thing. What we're saying is, I'm not noticing your race because when I notice your race, that's a bad thing. When I notice your race, bad things happen. So I'm going to be colorblind. But that also means you can't notice the condition, the culture of different people. And so sometimes, under the guise of universality, we say everybody's the same. And there may be some truth to that at a deep ontological level, but at a practical level, we're not all the same. We have different capacities, we have different experiences. And when we go to that false universality, we oftentimes say to marginalized people, hide those parts of yourself that make us uncomfortable. So I often tell the story about James Baldwin, and he, at the height of his literary career, he was invited to join this august literary club. But there was some caveats. And one caveat was, don't bring your, sort of uncouth friends to this club, rabble rousers, which translated as black. This is an upscale club, and we don't want you hanging out with rabble rousers. And the other was, we know you're gay, Mr. Baldwin, but actually we don't want to have to deal with that. So don't talk about your being gay. It was an early version of don't ask, don't tell. And Baldwin, who wanted to join this club, ended up leaving the United States, brokenhearted really, and writing a book called The Price of the Ticket. And he talked about the price of joining, the price of inclusion was too much. They were telling me to leave myself at the door. And the claim was, we're all the same. What does that mean? We're all heterosexuals? I'm not heterosexual. So Baldwin didn't join. And so sometimes when we talk about inclusion, which could even be a good move, we're trying to reach out to people, but we're including them on our terms. And we're telling them, this is the condition of your inclusion. I'm not going to notice that you're Muslim or that you're gay or that you're whatever. And it's not always pernicious. I live in the Bay Area, and the sort of cultural ethos is that you don't notice someone's disability. Again, the unconscious is noticing. The unconscious is not politically correct. And so I'm in a grocery store, and there's a woman in there who's trying to shop, and she has some sort of disability that makes it hard for her to walk, and she keeps constantly almost falling down. And I'm saying to myself, I'm not supposed to notice. And I'm certainly not supposed to offer any help. And finally I said, okay, forget it. I just walked up to her and I said, excuse me, miss, I don't want to assert myself in your life, but do you need any help? And she just sighed, thank you. So these are hard things sometimes to negotiate, and we don't always know the right thing to do. But the goal of the way we fix othering is not saming, but belonging. So these two competing visions that you saw in the film and in the schematic is that, do we have a small we who, in which case that small we is constantly under threat. It needs to control. It needs to make sure there's purity. And we see this in the United States and other places. So when we hear these small we's, whether it's in India or Russia or Turkey, or it also talks about the need to control the other and purity. And so it's not accidental that when we think about our history in the United States around race, there was an obsession with white purity, the one drop rule. The idea was that blackness contaminated whiteness. not just in terms of blood, although there was that. There's also in terms of neighborhood. So when you go back and read some of our um, literature, including some of our laws, for example, about not having neighborhoods be integrated. They talked about blacks and Jews contaminating the neighborhood. They compared them to having pig pens. So this is the story that we were taught. The same story was told about Chinese Americans in San Francisco at the turn of the century. So how we, other people, or how we create belonging, there's always a story associated with it. And so if we want a story of a larger we have to tell that story. We have to make it real. So it's not just a story, but we also have to have the cultural expression of what does it mean to be part of the we. And it's not melting into each other. It's actually acknowledging our differences. There's a South African word from Zulu called sawubona, which means I see you. It also means the God in me sees the God in you. We see you. We recognize you, not notice you. We recognize you. And we all need to be recognized. Charles Terrell from Canada wrote a whole piece on the politics of recognition. So belonging then requires recognizing our full humanity. It also requires that we have access to things, including the access to participate in the making of our society. So it's not a thin access. You can come in here. It's basically saying you are part of the we that constitutes the world. In order to belong, we need agency, power, care. Sometimes I substitute love and responsibility. So it's not just two people getting along, because you can have belonging at different levels. Two people getting along is not unimportant, but we're talking about also structures and institutions and norms. So we're talking about socially as well as individually. And we need power to make that happen, and not power over, but power with. And the power distribution in any given society, any given institution is not the same. So the mayor, the head of agencies have more power, but everyone has power. So let's talk about responsibility just for a minute. When you talk about these issues, oftentimes people claim a lack of responsibility, right? It's that I was not here when that happened. I didn't make that happen. And so while we're willing to sort of embrace the concept of personal responsibility, in the concept of belonging, we're talking about social responsibility, that we all share in the responsibility of creating a belonging city, a belonging environment. Like power, the responsibility is not the same. It's not symmetrical. So the responsibility of, again, the mayor or the superintendent of schools or the head of an organization is not the same as the person who just hired. But the person who just hired has responsibility as well. And this is actually somewhat controversial, because I'm saying in the context of race, in the context of gender, even the group that's marginalized has responsibility for moving forward. In fact, part of their marginalization is to say they're not responsible. They don't have power. So we want to reject that. So as we talk about creating a new Rockford or a new country, it can't be left to one group. Everybody has to participate and everybody share in the responsibility, which is different than saying you're guilty. It has a different feeling to it. But we're not just talking about at the individual level, we're also talking about at the structural level. And structures, we all live in structures, and structures live in us, but it's not all the same. The structures do a lot of the work in terms of saying you belong or don't belong. And we have to actually be affirmative of making sure the structures are doing the work to create belonging. And we've actually done a lot of work around this. We've actually coined the concept of opportunity structure, opportunity mapping, so we can literally map out how structures are situated and how people are situated in relationship to those structures in society. And we've done this now hundreds of times across the United States. And for example, in the context of housing, we talk about not just affordable housing, not just market rate housing, not even just integrated housing. We talk about opportunity-based housing. How do you actually situate housing so it actually promotes the kind of opportunity that different communities should want? And we've been recently asked to do that for the whole state of California. And that should inform how we actually build and place housing, especially below market rate housing. So belonging on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he situated as maybe the third most important need after physical and safety. Many of his students have said, no, it's the first, that you don't get food, safety, unless you belong. We literally come in the world attached to another human being. And so we simply cannot become self-actualized. We cannot become fully human without belonging. And yet we deny it to too many people, or we make it conditional. At UT Austin, there was an effort to increase the number of Black and Latino students, and there's something called the 10% plan that works relatively well, where they take the top 10% of students from each school can go to the flagship schools in Texas. That increased the number of Black and Latino students because the schools are segregated at the K-12 level. But when the Black and Latino students got to UT Austin, they weren't performing very well. And the school spent millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, trying to lift up the students' performance. And they were coming to the conclusion that maybe the students shouldn't be there. Maybe their K-12 education was so flawed that they simply couldn't cut it. And this is one student, they did a story about her in New York Times. Her mother even was saying, okay, maybe you should just come home and go to the community college because UT Austin is not good. Your grades are terrible. You're depressed. And the professor called these students together, the Black and Latino students, and talked to them about what it felt like being at UT Austin. Now, I had been at UT Austin myself because they tried to recruit me. And it was a wonderful campus, wonderful school. But as they were showing me around campus, they were showing me all this Confederate memorabilia. And they said, yes, we fought on the side of the South in the Civil War. We were a pro-slavery state. But don't pay attention to that. That's our past. But we know that the past has an impact on the present. That a lot of times when we're fighting over the past, we're really fighting over the future. But also, my unconscious was just popping. Because even though he was telling me to ignore it, I could try to ignore it consciously, but there's no way I could try to ignore it unconsciously. More importantly, the students were experiencing this every day, not just in terms of Confederate memorabilia, they were experiencing it in their curriculum, they was experiencing it in the structures. Everything was shouting at them, you don't belong, you're an outsider. And if you want to belong, the onus is on you to adapt to our school. This is not your school, it's our school. So the professor actually had this conversation with the students, and within a very short period of time, the students, Black and Latinos, start performing on par, and in some cases higher than their white counterparts. The researchers were so taken aback by this that they thought someone was cheating. They said this couldn't happen. It turns out, and since then there have been several studies replicating this. It turns out it wasn't that the students didn't have the cognitive ability. What they needed was belonging. And belonging actually impacts their performance. So when you don't belong, or you feel like you don't belong, it has a powerfully negative impact in terms of how you're going to perform. And that's true for any group. So not belonging, feeling like you're other, affects your health, affects your performance, affects, in this case, the Black students were depressed. All that, it doesn't fix everything, but you really can't actually thrive without a sense of belonging. So how do we generate this belonging? Well, we talked about breaking, bonding, and bridging. And breaking is the way you actually advance othering. Bridging starts to create a way of belonging. And breaking can happen again at a verbal level. It can happen, UT Austin, it can happen at an institutional structural level. Think about when we say, if someone has a disability, the law now says we have to make accommodations. So if you come to a building, if I'm in a wheelchair and I come to a building and there's no ramp, the building is saying to me, the structure of the building is saying to me, you don't belong. It doesn't have to be a person saying it. The very structure of the building can be saying that. This work, a lot of this work was started by Putnam in the United States, and he looked at it. The way we build social capital is through bridging or through communities. Here's just examples. Breaking is happening all around the world. And again, breaking oftentimes is the foundation of it is fear, that you're concerned that someone is going to take something from you or from your group. Bonding happens all the time. It happens in families. And bonding is not antithetical to bridging. But what we really want to get to is bridging. How do we actually build a society, build a city, build a community where we bridge? Bridging requires a practice of empathetic practice and empathetic listening. Sometimes we don't understand why people focus on their group. When I was growing up, it'd be like, why are you calling yourself African American? You're just American. It was interesting because in a sense, and this is Amartya Sen, who's an Indian Nobel economist, he says, when you focus on a group to marginalize them, to other them, you actually enhance that group's identity. They will become more, that identity will become more important to them. So if you isolate people because of their language or because of their religion becomes more important to them. And then the dominant group oftentimes is like, why are you focusing on your religion? It's because you're focusing on it, because you're using my religion as a marker for me not belonging. And so then I have to try to use that to become, have a sense of belonging. And I should be clear, when I'm talking about belonging, I'm talking about belonging without othering. So sometimes it's like, I can belong to my group, but we're othering other groups. So I'm talking about belonging without othering. Bridging, and I oftentimes cite my friend Bell Hooks, who says, bridges are made to walk on. And I tell the story about a pastor friend of mine, Pastor Michael McBride. When I talked to him about the need to bridge, which is the need to, bridging is done in a personal level by sharing, by listening to someone's stories, by suffering with others, by being empathetic. Compassion means to suffer with. And we don't listen to each other's stories. We don't listen to, it's like Robert Sapolsky basically says it requires recognizing each other's sacred symbols. What's important to you? And to bridge doesn't mean we agree. It doesn't mean I'm adopting your point of view. It means I'm acknowledging your humanity. I'm acknowledging that you suffer. I'm acknowledging that you have aspirations. I see you. But Bell Hooks reminds us that bridges are made to walk on. So when someone bridge, there's a good chance that both the group they're trying to bridge with and the group they're coming from will challenge them. Why are you working with those people? They're different than us. So it's not an easy thing, even though it's a critical thing. And we live in a country today, in a world today, where we've forgotten the art of bridging. We spend much more time breaking at every level, the institutional level, the cultural level, and we use the internet to break. And it's, sometimes we use breaking as a way of belonging. You attack someone so you can belong somewhere else. We can measure how much people belong And we do this at the Institute in something called the Inclusive Index. And it's also highly correlated with positive outcomes in terms of how long someone lives, how well they live, how they perform. It also tells us how people feel. Again, to belong requires co-creating and co-owning the structures we belong to. It means looking at social networks, which is where power oftentimes flow, as well as how institutions are arranged. Who makes the decision? Who pays for them? Who benefits? So again, there are long bridges and short bridges, and we can also think about how power is distributed. So when you start bridging, I would say, when I was talking about Micah McBride, he said to me, "So John, are you saying I have to bridge with the devil?" And I said, don't start there. Don't start with the most difficult bridge. Don't start with the longest bridge. Start with shorter bridges. Start with bridges where you have some power. And after you get better at it, then you can start extending those bridges. But also be careful who you call the devil. Be careful of the stories we tell about the other. When we break with people, we flatten them. They become one-dimensional. And that's a problem. We all have multiple identities. We all have multiple stories. And in those stories, there's actually movement. There's a possibility to create something new. When we flatten people to one identity, to one thing, it becomes harder to change. So how do we create a culture of belonging? Think about our networks. Think about how we value diversity. Create structured and unstructured opportunities to bridge and to link. Create spaces where everyone can be heard. Who's not at the table? What do people need to be at the table? How do they communicate? Who has power? How do you share that power? In order to create belonging, you start with intentionality. Then you create belonging stories. Then you create support and practice. And then you need containers to sustain it. It can't be just episodic. It can't just be what happens on the streets. You need institutional structures. And there's something we call GARE, which is Government Alliance for Racial Equity, which actually help governments deal with equity. And if we were doing it now, we'd actually name it belonging. It started a number of years ago. I'm one of the co-founders of that. And some of those governments now are moving more deeply into belonging. But you need a container. And you need good stories. What are the stories we tell? Notice in the story who the villain is. Notice who the protagonist is. And we're getting better. When the movie Black Panther came out, we rented a movie theater, we the Institute, and gave tickets away to the entire community, but especially the Black community in Oakland. There were young Black men who came to that, about almost 1,000 people. And they said it was the first time in their life, first of all, that they had come together and celebrating and seeing Black people portrayed positively. And that was sad. And then a few weeks later, we did the same thing with Wrinkle in Time. And the young girls had a similar experience. So who shows up in the story? Who's left out? How do we expand the circle of human concern so that everyone is in the story? Everyone counts. How do we actually use what we know about the mind science to connect people? This is relational. This is not just an abstract idea. We need to build trust. We need to learn to trust. And we can do that. And again, this happens on multiple levels: personal, strategic, organizational. So I'm taking you back to Detroit, and I'm close to the end of this presentation, but this is the Renaissance Center, for those of you who know Detroit. The Renaissance Center was initially built and owned by the Ford Motor Company. And in Detroit, which is the largest majority Black city in the country, they built a fortress around the Renaissance Center, so Detroit could not, so the people in Detroit could not get into the Renaissance Center. Many of the people working in the Renaissance Center were coming in from the suburbs. Most of them were white. And so there was literally structuring a break. The Renaissance Center was a break from the rest of the city. Well, General Motors eventually took over the Renaissance Center, and they took all those fortresses down, and they created public pathways. And they basically said, we want to be part of Detroit, not just in Detroit. And the appreciation that went out to General Motors was phenomenal. And I had the opportunity to talk to the president of General Motors, and they're embarking on trying to create a belonging culture at General Motors. So be aware that structures carry bias with them. Structures are designed to do something, and they do it unevenly, not because they're bad, but because we all have blind spots. So think about a flight. Remember when we used to fly? Think of the luggage racks. The luggage racks are over our heads. And the group that's biased against this, the group that's disadvantaged at that, are women. Women have less upper body strength. They tend to be shorter as a group. And this is maybe a little bit more controversial, they carry more luggage. So a lot of women say when they travel, they actually check their luggage, which means they had a half an hour on the beginning and end of the trip. So who designed this? Designed it, in a sense, with a male image in the back of their mind. They didn't design it with women in mind. So when we design structures, just like the Renaissance Center, how do we design them so they bridge? How do we design them so they are belonging structures for everyone? It's not just a ramp. How do we actually make structures say to people, this is your structure? So I'll end by talking about targeted universalism. So at the beginning, I talked about we're not just trying to close disparities. We're trying to get people to a goal. And what that goal is what's called the universal. The goal is universal. The strategy for getting there is targeted. And it's targeted based on how people are situated. So if you look at this little schematic, you see on the left, there's nothing blocking the person, so they go straight to the top. But the other parts of the structure are making it hard for people to get to the top. And so what we want to do is to design structures that are targeted based on where and how people are situated within structures, within culture, within power, to get to the top. That means knowing how those structures operate, knowing how people are situated. That means data. So we can do this. So again, it's not treating everyone the same. Everyone's not the same. Everyone's not situated the same. So targeted universalism, I sometimes refer to it as equity 2.0. We're not specifically or primarily focused on closing disparities. We're primarily focused on getting people to that stated universal. To start with identifying the goals, and then I should also point out that if you have a process of where you're saying scarce resources and people are competing over it, you are creating a breaking situation. So targeted universalism is not trying to get the most marginal group to that universal. It's trying to get every group to that universal. Targeted universalism then is both a programmatic strategy, but also a communication strategy. It allows us to talk about this in a way that don't pit people against each other. So we're concerned about everyone. We want everyone to belong, and we recognize that everyone is situated differently. And I can give you, this has worked across the country pretty phenomenally. I can give you examples if you like. And then we have to understand that their analysis is not the same as communication. Communication is not the same as narrative. Narrative is not the same as strategy, and strategy that's not the same as organizing. We have to do all these things if we're actually going to create a belonging community. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing that information. We've got a lot to digest there and ruminate on. But I would love to, at this time, open it up to the community. We've got some questions they want to hear from you as well. So each one of them kind of has a question that will represent various sectors of the Rockford community. And we will start with Mr. Aaron Carlin, who joins us today from the Rockford Public Library. Carlin, who joins us today from the Rockford Public Library.
Good morning. Is my audio? Good morning. Can you hear me all? Good morning. Is my
That echo is pretty amazing.
I'm inside a theater, so we muted the audio. Good morning to you in your time zone, Dr. Powell. My name is Aaron Carlin, and I'm the Assistant Director for Branch Services, Outreach, and our Maker Lab for the Rockford Public Library. And we do have your book, Racing to Justice, here for people to check out. I'm here with some people in the J.R. Sullivan Theater of our Nordloff Center for Performing Arts. And I'm very honored to be here learning from you today and helping to facilitate the message of belonging and inclusion throughout the Rockford region. Through my involvement with Pam Clark Reidenbach and Billy Callahan from NICNE and so many of the other folks participating here today, I feel particularly empowered. The awful injustices that are occurring in the world, and especially right here in the United States, have left me overwhelmed and previously wondering what or how in the world I could ever make a difference. Being involved with this group has given me the direction that I've needed. And so without further ado, may I ask you the first question?
Sure, I'm delighted.
All right. How can the topics of othering and belonging be made meaningful to those who probably don't feel they need to be inclusive to a population that they don't even come into contact with?
That's a great question. So two things. Great question. I'm hearing an echo. The good news is, or if a good situation is, over 70% of Americans feel estranged. We just did a study, and the Ad Council done a study. Most Americans don't feel like they belong. Even those who are white, middle class, well-educated. If you go back to that little video I showed at the beginning, something's happening. And the anxiety is actually moving across the whole country, if not the whole world. It's not the same. We don't want to create false equivalents. And some people feel like their world, whatever their world, they think of their world is slipping away from them. And they may blame it on an immigrant. They may blame it on, practices of gay marriage. They may blame it on, but, and it's sort of interesting because one of the things that they generally don't blame it on, Mr. Carlin, is technology. And in some ways, if you think about jobs, the most serious disruptor of jobs in the 21st century are not the movement of people. It's actually technology. And yet we can't put that genie back in the bottle. We can't say, okay, we're going to stop technology. So similarly, we're actually starting a major project on safety because everybody wants to be safe. So that's potentially a bridge. And I've worked some with police departments, for example, and when you listen, if you just blindfold and hear them talk, a lot of what they're saying is not that dissimilar to what the Black community is saying. They're afraid, they don't know if they're going to go home at night, they feel disrespected, they feel like people don't care. As you probably know, alcoholism is great, drug abuse, life expectancy, all of those things are depressed for police officers. And very similar, but they don't talk to each other. And it's not just talking, and it's also creating mechanisms, creating structures, creating stories. So in a sense, there's a lot of suffering and pain in the country right now and in the world. We can turn that into a positive. as I said, compassion means to suffer with. And I've worked with people all over the country. Um, just to give you one quick example, I was asked to give a talk about the Affordable Care Act. This was some years ago in rural Alabama. And and they were trying to actually extend Medicaid so they could actually um, um, serve more of their people. So they asked me to go talk to this group. And it was an all-white group. I would dare say all conservative, uh, probably all Trump supporters. Um, and literally, um, I don't know why they were there. And I was beginning to wonder why I was there. And my host, when they were pushing me out on the stage, they said, there was someone talking about this about a week ago and they were booed off stage, but good luck. You know, so I went out on stage and I started off by telling a little lie. I said, it's good to be here. I wasn't really feeling that at the moment. And they're all like sitting with their arms folded, about 400 people. And they knew I'd come to talk about the Affordable Care Act, which I think even naming it Obamacare is creating a problem. Words matter. And so I refuse to we don't call Social Security Roosevelt Social Security, we call it Social Security. So I started off by just saying, how many of you have had your insurance canceled or refused because of a pre-existing condition? Please stand up. And how many of you couldn't get a prescription filled because insurance companies decided it was cost too much, even though the doctor said it was essential? And how many of you lost your insurance because you lost your job? I asked about 3 or 4 questions like that. By now, everybody's standing up. And then I went around the room and I said, tell me your story, and what that felt like. And the pain that came out, by now, at this point, no one has their arm folded. Everyone's animated and they're mad, not at me, at the insurance company. And then at some point I pivot and I said, that's what's happening in the Black community. That's what's happening in the Latino community. That's what's happening in Chicago. That's what's happening. I didn't lose a single person. But I started off by listening to their pain, listening to their suffering, in a sense, acknowledging their humanity. And when I did that, it was very easy for them to acknowledge other people's humanity. Unfortunately, sometimes when we see these competition, we see there's only one thing and it's scarce. And if I get it, you lose. If you get it, I lose. So I do think that one reason people aren't so much indifferent as they're scared and they feel like they're losing something. And again, the vast majority of Americans, by every major research study, actually feels this. A colleague of mine, Strangers in Their Own Land, when did interviews in Louisiana, mainly with whites, and almost all of them felt like they were losing. So, so I think that with good leadership, good stories, and good practices, we can do a lot of work. Not necessarily all the work, but we can move the ball. And it's not your group comes in and my group gets kicked out. It's that how do we actually start building bridges where we all belong?
Right. Thank you so much, Aaron. And now we're going to move to Joyce Higgins, who represents the Booker T. Washington African American Resource Center. Joyce?
Thank you, Gabrielle. And hello, Dr. Powell. How are you today? Your work on othering and belonging is most impressive, as well as your information today was very informative. I know you've touched on some of my questions, so I'm going to go on and proceed because you talked about that othering and belonging is a process. And even though many don't want to come to the table, they have to be included. So with that being said, my question, many people still have a difficult time understanding the different ways of being or just communicating, especially when there's a conflict, especially when they feel perhaps they feel othered, is not willingness and not having a willingness to come to the table because they feel othered. Tell me this. As David indicated earlier, we have been working towards this process for some time now. How do we move together from just talking to action?
Right. Yes, thank you for the question. And yeah, like I said at the beginning, when I looked at a little bit about your efforts in the past, you've done some impressive things, but you have not gotten the results you want. And so that's part of your history. But I also think there's learning in that. There's something to that you can learn from why it didn't go as well as you had hoped in the past. Um, and there's not a simple answer, but I think there's an intention. So, for example, even you said people coming to the table. Uh, Maybe we shouldn't have a table. Uh, Maybe we shouldn't be asking people to come to us. Maybe we should go to them. Uh, and literally, I worked on the Navajo and Hopi Reservation some years ago, and that was the case. We couldn't get people to come to these meetings, so we went to them, and they were more than willing to meet on their. And oftentimes, we put the onus on the most marginal, the people with the least ability and the most power, the least power to sort of again accommodate. Um, and so, I would say to make sure, both in terms of demonstrating. So you might get some influencers from the community you're trying to reach to work with them so they can actually be your ambassador. Uh, it probably was not smart, although it worked out okay, for them to send me down to rural Alabama. If I'd have been thinking about it, maybe it would have been better to send me to Detroit. But the point is that how do we actually have people believe that this is a process that we really do want to hear from them, that this is their part of the process. And there's so many subtle ways to do this. I tell the story of one of the groups that actually commits the highest level of suicide, one of the professions, are dentists. And how people make sense of that is nobody likes dentists. It's like no one wants to go to a dentist, right? And then they got these, it's like a horror movie, right? They have these machines drilling in your mouth, and you're sort of strapped back. And I had to go to the dentist here after I moved out to California from Ohio, and I was dreading it, and I walked into the dentist's office, and they were playing. The dentist is black, but they were playing jazz and Motown, and I thought, wait, is this a real dentist? You're not supposed to play jazz and Motown at dentist. You're supposed to play that background torture movie music. The dentist has become my friend. I love going to the dentist. Literally, I sometimes just stop by to see him. And the reason I share that is that the environment can send a message. How do you say to people, we want this to be an environment that you're comfortable in, your environment. So we're going to move it around. We're going to host some of these meetings in the community. I teach at UC Berkeley, and there's a town gown thing. If you come to Berkeley, first of all, you can't park. If you find a park, it costs a lot of money. I mean, and then I say, we want the community to come. Community doesn't want to come there. I think it's a wonderful campus, but I'm a professor there and I have a parking spot. So look at some things. And then the last thing I'll say is if you can actually model it, if people can see, we work with churches, and their churches now are having belonging circles. And they've had over 1,000 meetings of people in the church talking about belonging. And then they reach out beyond the church. So there are all these different ways you can do things. But part of it is also understanding if people are not coming, it's perhaps because something happened in the past. As you said, it's not they just feel like the other, they probably have been other. We worked with schools to get police out of uniforms in schools. It's like, if you're gonna be in a school, you gotta be an educator. That's what schools are for. So you can't go there with your gun and billy club. It sends the wrong message. So there are a lot of things that can be done. And that has a huge impact in terms of once the police is seen as a coach, then bridges happen, and violence goes down. I mean, so there are all these things we can do to actually create a space of belonging.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the next question will be from Scotty Welch, and she represents the Liam Foundation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Powell. I'm intersex and I use the pronouns she and her. I am here today on behalf of the Liam Foundation and we serve the LGBTQIA plus community. The LGBTQI community is a community that has to fight every chance they get in life. They fight for a bathroom, to be identified the way they always felt, for health care, to attend a church, and not to be killed because of hatred. How do we make the LGBTQIA plus community feel like they belong in a society that makes it clear every day that we are less than human?
So I think, so I appreciate your question. Uh, so it's both feeling like you belong, right? But it's also belonging. Um, you know, that, so the symbols, and I would also say in terms of when I talked about belonging, everyone has a role in that, right? So it's not just you by yourself. You have to have people who actually embrace this, who may or may not be a part of your community, who may be straight, but who carry those values because you're trying to create something where you all belong. Um, and part of it, of course, I think the work that's already been done is coming out. And the same thing in terms of you have to actually talk about what's going on. You have to talk about, and my guess would be a lot of people start off very scared. My father was a Christian minister, and he died recently. But I watched his movement. I'll tell you a story. I have a friend one of my close friends, his son is gay, and he struggled with it. But because of his love for his son, because he had to struggle with it. His son didn't hide it. I've known his son since his birth. He eventually came to terms with it, and he said, my friend said, he's the problem. My friend's the problem, not his son. He said, this is my problem, not my son's problem. And then he was actually pleased and proud that he had gone through that transformation and become more open. And then the issue of transgender people came up, and he said, I can't go there. I've gone as far as I can. I'm done. And I said, you're never done. We're never done. This is an aspiration. This is a journey that we're all on together. This is what it means to be human. And there are things that could be done. I talk about this a little bit in my book. I talk about this with my students. And the job is not for LGBTQ students or people to fit into the world. The job is to create a world where we all belong. And again, I think being out of the closet matters. I think, and I recognize that when you come out of the closet, there's some danger. And how do we minimize that danger? We have to grapple with that together. And I told a story yesterday when I taught at the University of Minnesota. I publicly represented myself as ambiguous, with the idea that many of the students there left my classroom thinking that I was gay. And I did that to create a safer space because I was using the power and privilege that I have to create more space for gay and lesbian students. And literally the students came. I won't take too much time, but the students formed a committee of 5 students to come to my office, and they said, Professor Powell, there's a rumor going around that you're gay. Now we know it doesn't matter, but some of the students wanted us to come and ask you. I said, okay. I said, so what shall we tell them? I said, tell them that you asked. It changed the dynamics in my classroom. Gay students and lesbian students, and this was 20 years ago, so we weren't talking frankly about trans students, but it changed the dynamic. I was using my power to help create a safer space. So I would say to all of you, not just to you, but to all of you, how do you actually create a space where every group, and then how do you actually identify those groups who are being denied power, who are being denied safety? People respect the chief of police. People respect the mayor. How do they actually extend, do they use their power to actually create a space where everyone can belong?
Thank you so much. The next person we'll hear from is Barb Chidley, and she represents the city of Rockford as a neighborhood specialist.
Hi, Dr. Powell. You just referred to being able to use your power and your privilege to create some really important change. In my prior career as an urban educator, and now increasingly in my work with residents in our neighborhoods, I have become highly aware of the privilege that I have as a white person that many others don't share. Unfortunately, the topic of white privilege is something that can create a lot of conflict in conversation. How do we establish effective dialogue with others who also have privilege around the topic?
That's a great question. I know Robin DiAngelo, who's sort of now associated with the whole concept of white privilege and white fragility. So belonging is different in some ways, in the sense that the goal is not to call people out, is to call people in. It's not to say, I've written about it and I'd be happy to share with you. I don't really ascribe to the concept of allyship at a thick level. I wrote something years ago when Minister Farrakhan was having the Million Man March. You may remember that. And I was somewhat of a public figure. People said, John, you have to go. You probably should be on the platform. This is really important to show our solidarity with basically 1 million Black men. And at the end of the day, I decided not to go. And I wrote something, and what I wrote was, people said, are you not going because of Minister Farrakhan's position on homosexuality, or because of his position on Jews, or a position on women? Are you going out of solidarity with those communities? And I said, no. And I said, those values are my values. I'm not doing this because my friends are, this is who I am. I don't ascribe to a world, well, that's the way you treat people. I think it's wrong. So back to your question on privilege, though, and I wrote a little bit about this in my book. We think of it as a negative thing. I know Peggy McIntosh has sort of brought it to our attention years ago. My kids are both went to college. My daughter went to Harvard. She's considers herself, I think, pretty radical, pretty progressive. And when she was younger, it's like, when she was going to go to Harvard, I said, I have friends there I can call and help you get in maybe. And she said, no, that's not fair. I should make it on my own. That's using, that would be extending privilege to me. And I said to her, you already have privilege. You come from an upper middle class family. Both your parents are professors. There's no way for you to shed all your privilege. What you can do is use your privilege to help others. The question is not whether or not you have privilege. The question is, how do you use your privilege? And so I say that to say that sometimes we talk about white privilege, we talk about it as an indictment. And it can be misused. It can be an entitlement to close the door behind others. What happened in Central Park was a vitriolic, nefarious example of privilege. She was using her privilege to actually call the police on a Black man, knowing all the social implications of that. But if she hadn't done that, she still would have white privilege. I said yesterday, I'm almost, I used to be almost 6'5", now I'm closer to 6'2". In this country, for every inch a man is over 6 feet, over the course of his life, he'll make $150,000. That's height privilege. I didn't ask for that. I'm not going to try to be shorter. I guess gravity is making that happen anyway. But I can be aware of it. And I can actually use it in a positive way and not use it in an inappropriate way. So we all have privilege, like we all have power. Will we use it well? Will we use it to open up things as opposed to close down things? And I'm concerned, frankly, if we use whether it's the idea of white privilege or whatever as a way of bludgeoning people. Because again, the idea of belonging, which is different than, it's really everyone belongs. It's not white people belong, but not black people. It's not black people belong, but not white people. It's not straight people belong, but not LGBTQ people. It's everyone belongs. And that has to be, and that's when I talked about being responsible. We all become responsible for that. And I, frankly, there are aspects of what we call the racial social justice movement that creates breaking. And I'll give you an extreme example. So I'm associated with people who are part of the police abolition movement. And I think that why I understand, and this is a deeper discussion, people are saying police are not serving the Black community. And in many cases, that's true. And it has this long history, especially in the South. But it's not to attack a police officer, him or her. It's different than attacking the system. And I say, if we get to the point, maybe we'll never do, but if we get to the point where we say we don't need half the police that we have, or maybe we don't need any of them, what happens to those people? They have families, they have jobs, they have bills, we still have to build a bridge to them. We still have to say they are part of our we. They are part of our circle of human concern. They belong. Now, killing people don't belong. Killing people recklessly doesn't belong. But we have to hold on to people. And so I get concerned sometimes that we associate justice with flipping the switch, right? We want some groups out and some groups in. No, we want all groups in. And so I think a racial justice movement, a certainly belonging movement from my perspective, can't bludgeoning someone for being whatever. Last thing I'll say, we work with major corporations all over the country. We work with Apple, work with Google, work with Facebook. And they're, and at the same time we critique them. But we offer a bridge. We offer an option for them to actually really stand on the side of a belonging society, recognizing these are trillion-dollar companies in some cases. And yes, they do things that are very nefarious, but they can also do really great things. And can we have a conversation about that? We don't start off by saying we won't talk to them because they are corporate America, or because they're the police, or because they're a certain race, or because that to me is just another form of breaking.
All right. Thank you. And next we will hear from Ellen Ammer, and she represents the Center for Nonviolence Conflict Transformation.
Hi, thanks, Gabrielle, and hello, John Powell and everyone else who's here. Woven into what you say is something that's really close to my heart and soul. You've touched a little bit upon it when you talk about responsibility, and again when you answered Scotty's question. What I see too often is that this sort of work is focused either internally or it's focused externally. So could you talk a little bit about a holistic, a both and approach to the internal and external, and especially within the context of healing?
Right.
Now, both ourselves and our world.
Well, that's a great question. So I often cite a jazz player named Don Cherry. He has a line in one of his songs saying, "And the outside is not, the inside is too." And what he's playing with is that that inside and outside are interactive. In the book that I wrote that I guess it's in your library, I talk about the notion of separating ourselves from the world and the way we think of. So there's a former colleague of mine who's recently passed, has written a book called Durable Inequality. And basically he says we're what he calls methodological individualists, meaning that we reduce everything to the individual. And he argues that we need to look at structures and systems. And I think he's right. But to the flip side, I think it was Gandhi who was saying we'll never have structures and systems so good that we don't have to do internal work. So I think we have to work at multiple levels. We have to be aware that we are part of each other. I gave a talk earlier this week to 1,000 meditation teachers, and gave a slight nudge, basically saying the work can't just be done sitting on a couch or sitting, that we're talking about the world, we're part of the world. And institutions matter. Institutional arrangements matter. How do you build that tower in Detroit matters. How we have voting matters. The physical structures matter. And there's this interaction between the physical and the internal. And that's part of the work I do in the context of spirituality, is recognizing that spirituality is embedded both in our bodies and our souls, if you will, but also in the world. We have to have a world where we recognize we're in relationship with each other and with the world itself. And how do we actually have stories and institutions that animate that? Sometimes we'll pull apart and go be quiet. I'm a social introvert, but we're always in the world. We're always part of the world. So I think that the work has to take place at multiple levels, and that we in our society tend to be binary, of either or instead of both and. And we need a gradient that allow people to actually occupy those different roles. So if I know you're talking about or considering becoming a belonging city, then how do you actually structure that? And at the same time, at the Institute, we hire cultural workers. There's a reason we have people go see Black Panther. Culture matters, music matters. It's not accidental that the spirituals was a part of the abolitionist movement during the time of enslavement. So we have to really capture the whole person, but also the whole of society.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Leon Miller, and he is with the 815 Eliminate Racism. Mr. Leon, you there?
Oh, now, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. My question is from Harlan Johnson, and it goes, there seems to be two conflicting strategies among groups working on racial justice. One is to encourage people working together, and another is for Black and white people to work separately. So what strategy do you think is most effective and why?
Well, interesting question. I think part of it depends on what you're trying to do. And I think I would even say to some extent, maybe you can call those tactics. And it also depends on your context. But I think that ultimately people have to work together. People have to be together. I think that there's a danger of falling into an essentialist mode. We talk about race being a social constructed. Well, how is it constructed? And it's being reconstructed right now. How we think about race in 10 years and 20 years would be very different than how we think about it now. And it's not just in terms of people, it is people, but it's also in terms of norms and structures, the last question that the person asked. So it's understanding our history, understanding the role of our structures, and then understanding aspects of ourselves. The world is getting smaller. The option of being, from my perspective, just lay it out, and others don't necessarily have to embrace it, is that we're profoundly interrelated to each other and to the earth itself. Profoundly interrelated. How do we actually live that in a real way? That doesn't mean there won't be times where we want or need to go off by ourselves, whoever ourselves are. But that has to be cabin. That has to be a small thing. That has to maybe even be a place where we can heal or get our sea legs. But then we have to go back out in the world. If we move away from the world will keep impeding and pressuring us. So I think that I wouldn't say categorically you never do work by yourself, but I think it has to be limited because we are part of each other. And we're trying to create, when I talk about belonging, it's not belonging for Black people, it's not belonging for straight people, it's belonging for everyone. And the best way to see other people's humanity and practices is to be in relationship with them. We are in relationship with them. We're in relationship with the earth itself. So again, I think from a limited perspective, there may be some benefit of people being by themselves, but only limited. I think ultimately we have to find a way to come together and move back and forth between different possibilities.
Okay. And the next question comes from Shiraz Tata. She is a community activist and a licensed clinical psychologist.
Hello, Mr. Powell.
Hello.
Professor Powell, it's great to have you with us, and I'm going to share a question that's been weighing on my mind and heart for a while. To me, as a concerned citizen of our beloved city of Rockford, there seems to be an impasse between our city officials and the police and a group of protesters affiliated with Rockford Youth Abolitionists and the May 30th Alliance, perhaps because the latter do not want to talk with those in the establishment until some of their list of demands are addressed or met. Many of us who have been working on it, trying to eliminate racism and other forms of oppression in Rockford, including myself, may not agree with all that the folks involved with RYA say and do. But I do think they are demanding the addressing of systemic oppression and police brutality, that things that many of us, including our mayor, I know, are working to address and want to address. So I'm wondering if you can help us a little here. I am wondering how to build or rebuild trust between all people who may have different voices and ways of communicating and engaging than I might or those in the establishment might, to come together to help us move forward and make some progress.
Well, thanks for the question, and those are very pressing questions that's happening all over the country. Certainly, that's happening here in the Bay Area, so again, very complicated. So I work with a lot of groups. I'm just trying to figure out how much to say, because sometimes you work and people want you to amplify what they say. Sometimes you work with people and they want it to be private. So I'm trying to respect that. But I think you have to create a space where people can, and it may not be everybody. Public meetings are, frankly, important, but there's sometimes performance. And so people are not talking to each other, they're performing for somebody else. And while that can be important in terms of energizing people, it also means in those situations that people sometimes can't show vulnerability, they can't compromise, they can't show understanding, because that would actually be inconsistent with their performance. So is there a space that you can do it, where people can come together and start to hear each other? And it might be not simply on the issue at hand. It might be in a whole different situation. I have been asked here in the Bay Area if I would play the role that you're talking about. And this is how it was presented to me. It's like we have a commission that's been created to look at policing. The commission, in part, was brought together by appointees from the community, from the mayor's office, and from the city council office, and maybe others. But the word that I've heard is that it's not going well. And so someone said to me, one of the elected officials that remain nameless, asked if I would step in to try to help fix this. And my sort of sarcastic remark is, I'll fix the police right after I fix climate change. What the person was saying, though, is that you're the bridge. You are a bridge, not the bridge. There are many bridges. Not everyone agrees with you, but everyone respects and trusts you. And so you can talk to people. You don't agree with everyone's position. They don't agree with your position. They may challenge you, but they will listen to you. And part of the thing is that bridging is not simply agreeing, it's actually recognizing each other's humanity. It's being willing to listen. And out of that, oftentimes people do change their mind. It's not impossible, but it's harder to hate up close. And so you try to create a space where you're just willing to listen to each other. And so you might do something that's low risk. Again, at a different time, you might say, let's have lunch. People from different sectors, the police, the community, the mayor's office, maybe corporate office, come together and just have lunch and talk and not try to get to a conclusion. Now, you mentioned about demands. Demands are already at a very heightened level, right? And they may be appropriate, but it's not necessarily the best way to bridge, because it's saying, formally, it's saying, either I get this or I'm going to do something. It's, there's a sense of threat associated with it. Demonstrations actually happen mainly because people feel like their voice is not being heard. So the mechanisms for hearing voices, for being amplifying your voice, feel like they're not working. So I'm going to go outside of the normal process, and I'm not going to write a letter to the mayor. I'm not going to go to a city council meeting. I'm not going to necessarily vote. I'm going to demonstrate. And then the next thing is like the demonstration can actually become charged. That reflects that people are not feeling heard. I don't know if you're in a relationship, but think about a relationship. People yell at each other, literally yell at each other because they feel like they're not being heard. So it's like, why are you screaming at each other? Because she's not listening. It's like, okay, whether she's listening or not, she hear you. I can hear you across the hall screaming. But really what it speaks to is that something's broken down. And there needs to be some place to restore this. And again, it may not be in a public place. But you may ideally let the public know. You don't want people thinking that you're making backdoor mail or back hall agreements. But there needs to be some group of people from these various sectors who can begin to actually come together and talk and we see each other as people. And I don't know if that's actually possible now, but I think that's part of what has to be done. And I've actually told the people here that I would be open to considering playing that role with others here in the Bay Area of bridging. At the end of the day, bridging is acknowledging, offering to see someone's humanity. It's not saying we're going to get what we want.
Thank you. Our original program was to end at 2:00 today. However, our gracious media sponsor is allowing us to continue so that we have the opportunity to get to everyone's questions. The mayor, however, is on a different time schedule, so he would like to come on now, if he could, please. And he just wants to give us some remarks on our subject matter today. So I'm going to bring on our mayor, Mr. Tom McNamara.
Well, hello, Dr. Powell, and thank you so much for being with us today. I just want to say thank you for the powerful words and ideas that you have shared with us. You're certainly challenging us today to be better. You've challenged us to look at issues through a new lens. And one of my favorite people in Rockford always tells me, when you know better, you must do better. And so I think now today, from here on out, we all must do better. So thank you for the great words that you've provided us today. I also want to say a thank you to the organizers who were able to bring you in, Dr. Powell, to our community. A special thank you to NICNE, to Transform Rockford, to the Shellstrom Family Foundation, and to our media partner, WREX Channel 13. I also want to thank all those who are joining us virtually today. Your presence and participation shows a true commitment to helping our community move forward. And finally, I think we're in an incredible time, not just across the world, across the country, but right here in Rockford. We're right now having long overdue conversations about race, class, and social justice issues. We're examining how issues of equity and equality. We're listening to voices who, quite frankly, have not been listened to in the past. And most importantly, we're taking action on issues that should have been addressed long ago. Again, Dr. Powell, I just want to say thank you for being here. I'm just so excited as I look at the city of Rockford. We certainly have challenges, but in each one of these challenges, there's opportunities ahead of us. Rockford's best asset has always been our citizens, our people. We truly are all in this together. Our challenges, in my opinion, will never be opportunities unless we reject the old jargon of us versus them, or we continue with rhetoric like you need to fix this or they need to do X, Y, and Z. We need to move beyond this old rhetoric, in my opinion, and move forward with we together need to address our collective challenges and turn them into opportunities. And I absolutely loved your example of the topic of safety. I go to literally hundreds of neighborhood meetings, church basements, and in a typical year, not 2020. And I have yet to come across a single Rockfordian who does not want to be safe. But every single one of those people I've come across, safety means something very different to them than it may mean to me or even to you, Dr. Powell. And I think it's incumbent on us collectively to develop a community where everyone is belonging, where everyone is safe, where everyone feels safe, and that they have a space in our community and are valued and are treated with respect and dignity. And again, just thank you to all the organizers and especially you, Dr. Powell. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Gabrielle.
Thank you, Mayor McNamara.
Thank you, Mayor McNamara. All right, our next question comes from Luz Ramirez, and she is with the YWCA of Northwestern Illinois.
Professor Powell, you talk about bridges metaphorically. Rockford is a city divided by a river with several bridges. The haves live on one side and the have-nots live on another. The divide is marked by racial and financial disparities. How do you create belonging in a community where two sides of town lack appropriate resources and not all Rockford residents have a fair chance?
Great. Well, again, these are aspirational, and they must be reflected in program and structures and power. As I mentioned earlier, California is about 3 or 4 million units short of housing. That's actually a state. They've asked us to look at their housing and develop housing plans going for the next 20 years in California. This started before the pandemic, so everything may have to be renegotiated. But what we did is talked about a vision and where everyone would belong. We actually did a movie on California about where everyone belongs, but then talked about what it would take to get us there. And we actually literally said, as I mentioned earlier, opportunity-based housing. So we're housing we don't put all poor people here and all rich people here. We actually think about people who are unhoused. Housing is a hub to other things, including wealth, schools, places to shop, safety. Housing is oftentimes the centerpiece of that. So I guess there are many ways of approaching it, but it's not just an idea. It's not just how do we talk about it. How do we actually begin to actually reimagine our city so that what I think I read is that your city is not growing very fast. That changes what you can do. If you're growing, it gives you a new set of tools. But I think doing it together, what the mayor said in terms of everybody sort of being on board, and even having people and asking people, what do you need to be on board? And I worked with I worked with Portland. They had some serious problems in terms of housing. We actually were able to get the community on something called the Metropolitan Council, which does planning for the region. And it worked relatively well. One of the challenges was as people from different community groups, different races, different ethnicities got on Met Council, they saw themselves as advocating exclusively for their community. And I was part of the process, and Maxine Fitzpatrick, she wouldn't mind me saying her name. She had been a housing developer, a Black woman, really wonderful woman. She said, "I'm not used to advocating for people who aren't Black." And I said, "Well, if you're gonna have this capacity, if you're gonna have this role where you're looking at, I think it was like 40 or 50 billion dollars, you have to do it for everybody. It doesn't mean you disappear Black people. It doesn't mean you drop them out. But belonging is creating something not just for your group, but for everyone. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're probably not the right person to do this." So I think if you can create a space where people see that they really are in it together. And so when you think about housing development, I don't know enough about whether, you have inclusionary zoning, your schools. How do you actually start stitching things together at multiple levels? And that question should be asked to the people of Rockford, right? Here's the vision. Here's the aspiration. Now we need all of us on deck to actually figure out. We want to make sure no one's left behind. I talked earlier today about taking the police out of uniform in schools. If you're going to have, I don't know what the demands are, but there needs to be some way of moving the police department. The police department have legitimate concerns, safety, one being asked to do a very difficult job, sometimes being asked to do a job that's impossible. But the community also have concerns. Historically, in the Black community, they haven't felt like the police really represented them. The police was there for them. I asked my students at Berkeley, how many of you would call the police if there was some kind of crisis? Not one Black male student said they would call the police. That's a problem. That can't persist. And this is in Berkeley. So anyway, I think that having some process, having some containers, having some resources, having some experimentation, looking to see what other places have done, because there's, different cities and different parts of the country and different parts of the world are different places on this journey. There may be stuff that's appropriate for Rockford and may not be.
Thank you.
And our next question comes from Earl Dotson, and he's with the Rockford Public Schools.
Greetings, Dr. Powell. My name is Earl Dotson Jr. I am the Chief Communications Officer for the Rockford Public Schools, and hello to everyone else. Again, I want to thank you, Dr. Powell, again, just for spending time with our students today. Really appreciate that. And just my question, I'm just going to build on kind of what Lou said and kind of what's already been discussed. But in our diverse communities, such as Rockford, where sometimes our ethnic minorities feel disenfranchised or there's a historical lack of trust in our institutions, how do you change the mindset of our public and private sector leaders, continue to partner with them to be more inclusive in their decision making and practice more belonging?
Well, one thing, and I don't know what's happening in Rockford right now, but one thing that unfortunately the death of George Floyd and his daughter said he didn't die in vain. So these issues are on the table. And I think Chase Bank, for example, just announced recently a multi-billion-dollar platform to try to actually enhance Black entrepreneurs. The school I'm at, Berkeley, has a plan. So people are thinking, and they're thinking in a way that out of the box that they would not have thought of years ago. Some of you may know that the Washington Redskin football team, Redskin, the Native community had been objecting to that for decades. They've agreed to come up with a new name. We watched the NBA where NBA players in a bubble in Atlanta were talking about the need to be involved. Michael Bloomberg, frankly, whom I work with, he invested in having returning citizens get the right to vote in Florida. He's a multi-billionaire. So I guess I'm saying that there's a lot of interest. And one of the things we're actually trying to do is actually, like we do with cities, like we do with government, we bring them together so they can learn from each other and promote belonging and equity. And that's been really quite successful. We're trying to actually explore the same thing in the private sector. So now there are a lot of private sector entities who say they want to do the right thing, and some of them I think are serious. Now, the challenge is to do something different means stop doing something you've been doing. It's not just an add-on. And so, as I said, the proof is in the pudding. It's not clear whether people will actually do what's necessary to do, even if they can figure out what that is, because it might mean stop doing some things they've done in the past. But they're open to the discussion. And that's certainly happening at the national level. I would say even the global level. I don't know the companies in Rockford, but I think having space to have this conversation and then seeing if you can build on it. My sense is, at least for much of the country, is that you don't have to convince people that something can be done, need to be done. You may have to convince them what it is or how to think about it. But at least for the time being, we have this window where people believe, many people who historically didn't believe. I'm part of a group called NICNE, which is Institute for New Economic Thinking. It has 8 Nobel laureates in economics associated with it. And we're engaged in new economic thinking. So it's not just, I don't know if we'll land right, but at least we're trying. So I would create spaces in Rockford. And when I talk about these containers, that would be one of them. And these containers need to be connected with each other so they're not isolated. But create space where people can talk about this. But I would also try to do some things relatively quickly to symbolize that we're not just talking, that we are, whether it's putting some money on the table, whether it's engaging with having advisory boards, but also some of the things require deeper thinking. And institutions actually discipline each other. So one institution can only do something if another institution it actually is in relationship with allows it to do. So to give you guys a quick example, we know that banks, for example, by and large, banks don't keep their debts anymore. So they loan money, they take that money, that debt, and they actually sell it. They sell it to, in the case of mortgages, they sell it as securities. So the security apparatus in that equation tell the banks what it will buy. The banks, 30-year mortgage, the banks can't carry most mortgages 30 years. They need to sell them. So the security apparatus is disciplining the bank as to what the bank can do. And so when you get into structures, you get into sort of these interlocking engagements, and you have to work at multiple levels. I don't want to get into the weeds, but I think having a process to do that so that a company can continue to thrive and it can do something, and those who are disciplining it can actually support that as well. So you have to work at these multiple levels. But the first thing is just the commitment and agreement that you're going to do something different.
Fascinating. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Professor Powell, we have about 4 more questions. Are you able to hang on the line with us and answer those questions?
Well, I'm able to hang on the line. I don't know if I can answer the questions, though.
I'm sure you can, but if you have the time, we really would be appreciative.
Yes, more than willing to.
Thank you so much, sir. All right, we'll move then to Rashonda Williams, and she represents the Rockford Park District. Rashonda.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Powell.
Hi.
I believe my question has been answered in some capacity since we've been on here, but I'm going to ask the question anyhow because I think it's important to go back to it. So how does creating a community of belonging help with racial inequities within the workforce, housing, neighborhoods, and healthcare?
So a great question. Thank you for your question. And to some extent, Shonda, that all of those inequities point to the fact that groups don't belong. So data is one of the things. I mean, when I go into companies or whatever, the first thing I do is ask for data. Uh, so um, not belonging is not simply a question of someone not looking at you or not liking you. Um, it reflects it in terms of the um, resources not being available. It's reflected in terms of opportunities not being available. It's reflected in terms of you're not at the table making the decisions. Um, and so belonging has to actually change all that. You're basically saying we believe that every group belongs. Then how does that reflect it? Well, it's reflected in terms of who makes the decision, who benefits, and who pays. Um, so how do you actually structure housing? How do you structure schools? How do you structure jobs? Uh, and at the end of the day, belonging is both about a process and an aspiration, but it's also about outcomes. How do you know you're making progress? We're making progress because one, how people feel, but two, people's life chances and involvement in life actually changes. Um, and so that has to be the goal. And it's done in a way, going back to an earlier question, where we're not saying we win, you lose. Unfortunately, in our country, many issues are framed around winning and losing. We're just about to have the election. Instead of like, how do we all win? And I'm saying you need a mayor, you need a governor, but how do you actually say this is about for all of us? There's a friend and colleague that who's very prominent in terms of the First Amendment issues, and people offered us money to come debate the First Amendment issues, and both of us pushed back, saying we don't want to debate. We want an inquiry where we're trying to figure this out together, starting from different places. So too often we sort of structure these things almost like football games. There's a winner and there's a loser. So the Black community winning shouldn't mean the white community losing. The community winning should mean the business community losing. How do you actually begin to actually think about how these things move together? And the good thing is there's some examples of this around the world. And we look around the world, not just the United States. And some of these things might be appropriate for Rockford to consider.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. And then we will go to Fanny Owens, who's a resident of Rockford. Is Fanny still with us? Okay. Well, she has left her question with us, and that question was, can you share with us the importance of an equitable balance within the community?
Oh, I got it now. It was muted.
Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Fanny.
Yeah, anyway, I was saying that thank you for coming, and your presentation was just awesome. And you talked about the institutional and systemic racism and the fears and the trauma that and psychological effect that people who are the other, perceived as the other, experience. And you talked about like bridging, bonding, and virginity. All those things come into play, and I think it was a great refresher. And the mayor also talked about all the things that he was doing also, so that was great news too. I wanted to know, can you share the importance of equitable balance in a community?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and like all these questions, or many of them anyway, they deserve much more attention. And the good news is some of these questions have been, at least in some form, grappled with in the past. There's a concept of, part of it's developed by Amartya Sen, who's a Nobel economist from India. He talks about essentially what do you need to actually fully participate in society. And I've written about this as well. And it changes from society to society. If you fall below a certain level, your ability to belong, your ability to effectively participate also declines. So I believe, and I've written an article about this, I believe that part of our requirement is that everyone has what they need to fully participate. And that's going to shift from society to society, and from time to time. So example, in 1950, you didn't need a computer to participate. You didn't need the internet to participate. Now you do. Now it's hard to imagine. You know, go someplace and they say, what's your cell phone number? It's like, how do you even know I have a cell phone? You know, but implicit in that is that you can't effectively participate in society without some access to the internet. 20 years from now, it's going to be something different. So when there's extreme inequality and when people don't have the basis, and it's different than just saying having food and shelter. We need more than food and shelter to be full members of society. And you can sort of start to think about what that looks like in Rockford, right? So sometimes it might mean I talked to the students this morning. There was a suit brought in Detroit basically saying students were graduating and they couldn't read. And implicit in that, and the suit was won, but implicit in the suit is that you can't effectively participate in society if you can't read. And you can't vote. You can't join the military. It's hard to get a job. So anyway, and that's becoming more true. So I would say to sort of, for each community, in this case for Rockford, to think about what do people need to fully participate? What do people need to fully belong? And some of the things are obvious and some will be less than obvious. And they'll change. They'll change as conditions change. But one thing we know, and this is what I wrote in the piece I wrote, the most important thing we give or deny people is not food, it's not shelter, it's the full right to participate with an effective voice. Because out of that, all the other decisions are made. Now, Amartya Sen, I've quoted him a couple of times. He wrote a book called Development as Freedom. He's an Indian Nobel economist. And he asserts that famine in India is not a result of lack of food primarily. He says that famine is a result of lack of voice, lack of democracy. And he goes back hundreds of years and he says there's never been a famine or people have never died of starvation who had an effective voice. Now you might think, well, no, we got to give these people food. And yes, you do have to give people food. But he's saying food is actually a consequence. The lack of food is a consequence of not having an effective voice. And so in the piece I wrote, I play off of that and say that the first right, the first thing people need is an effective voice. They need to be seen and to be heard. And then they collectively will figure out and engage in all the other things that are needed and how to do that. So that's one place I would at least suggest you look at.
All right, and next we will hear from Ron Jackson, who represents RAMP, which stands for Regional Access and Mobility Projects.
Hello, Dr. Powell, and thank you for your wise words today. My question is, as a member of the disability community, how do you see that community playing a role in building a community of inclusion and building bridges to belonging?
That's a great question, Ron. Well, as I mentioned, I run this fairly large institute at Berkeley. We have clusters where we focus on different areas like LGBTQ, and disability is one of our clusters. And what the disability folks themselves say is, of course, that most of us, if we live long enough, we will become disabled.
Yes.
So we're just sort of passing through. So again, I think that give voice to make sure our structures, our practices, our culture reflects that. I have children and one grandchild, and as far as I know, and I'm not a big television watcher, culture matters. I do know that. But there's only one popular television show where the protagonist, the hero, is disabled. We got to fix that. We would not be satisfied if there's only one protagonist who was Black. So part of how we represent, part of how we, and also think, speaking of represent, I don't know if you were on a call when I talked earlier, there are more disabled people in the United States than there are Black, Latino, and Asians combined. So where are they? You know, you can go for days or weeks without seeing someone who's visibly disabled. Just like the gay community literally had to come out of the closet, I think the disabled community has to actually be in our presence, in our midst, in all of our institutions, and participate in terms of constructing that world where we all belong. So I think that's part of it, to make sure. And the American Disabilities Act did some work, but it just opened the door. Now we have to really make sure that becomes a reality.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay, well, that was our final question. And we as a community, we want to continue to reflect on these concepts. So what do you think we should be asking ourselves? Can you maybe provide us with some questions and some things we can work on so that we continue to hold ourselves accountable to the things that we've learned today?
Yes, I mean, we are, you know, depending on how much you want to do, we actually have a project that actually helps organizations, institutions, and cities or governments become belonging entities. So I can definitely make sure that our folks that you're in relationship with some of those folks, and then you see how far you want to go. But I think part of it is having those containers and those commitments, so you can and figure out how to then resource them. So how do you make sure that going forward, as I said, this is not a one-off. You sort of have this being sustainable, having some goals, having some practices, and having commitment from key players, from the community, from government, from the nonprofit, from the philanthropic community. Can you get those people in line? And then if so, then how do you then curate it so that they actually are doing what they need to do? And it may be hard in the context of one of the questions was asked about the community in relation with the police. That's actually an important area, but that area also may be a long bridge right now. That may be one of the more difficult things to do, because if you don't already have a space of trust and practice involved, that may be a hard, I'm not saying you don't engage it, but maybe a hard one to start with. So I would say three things. One, we and others would be available to help work if that made sense. Two, I said this early on, since when I looked at your impressive list of things you've done in the past, why didn't they produce? Why didn't they produce what you want? To really take a little time to sort of systematically go back and say, this is what we learned, this is what, and it might be that we didn't have enough resources, it might be that we didn't have the right people, it might be that that it wasn't the right program, but to know that. So the next time you do something, because in a sense, each time you try something, if it doesn't turn out well, the next time becomes harder. People become tired, people become cynical, and so you want to make sure as you move forward, there's no guarantee, but that your chances of actually having a positive outcome actually is there. And then the third thing is to do something immediate, to whether sit down with the editorial board at the newspaper and say, this is what we're going to do, spend a little time curating it, and these are the people involved. We're going to have another town meeting in 3 months or 2 months. Here are the people who, anyway, to start on this journey, so you keep some energy behind it. So those are some of the things that I would suggest.
Fantastic. Well, we are going to end our talk today. Unfortunately, we got to go. We can't keep you. We'd love to. We'd love if you just lived here and we could just call you every day and be like, hey, John, we got this issue here. But unfortunately we can't. But meeting you has been a tremendous privilege. I just want to personally tell you, as a young person, that I take full responsibility for it being my turn to take the torch and run with it. I honor your work. And I just want you to know that as a Black elder, that your life has not been in vain. I will personally use my life to impact and change the world. So thank you for your wisdom. I will use your term, sawubona. Thank you for giving us something that we as a community, we have to continue to ponder and reflect upon. So God bless you. And I would like to ask everyone that is on the call with me to please unmute. And we are going to all give you an applause at the same time together. Everyone can join me.
Thank you.
So thank you so
I
much.
see you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Powell.
Thank you.
Take care. Be well.
Yep, we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
God bless. Gabrielle, can you stay on?